Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture we're going to set up our Visual Studio. Alright, so with the Unity layout set up, let's make sure Visual Studio is also set up correctly. I'm going to be using version 22 Community. This one is the free version. You don't absolutely have to use the same code ID that I'm using. You can use Rider or VS Code or whatever you want. So let's see my setup for Visual Studio. But first let's actually set up something over here in Unity. So let's go up top into Window, and then let's open up the Package Manager. Then over here on the drop-down menu, let's select the packages and select the ones from the Unity registry. Then let's scroll down to find the Visual Studio Editor package. So here it is, this one. This package basically handles the integration with Visual Studio, so you can use the debugger and a bunch of things. Alternatively, there's also a package over here for Visual Studio Code, and there's also one over here for JetBrains Rider. So if you're using a different IDE, go ahead and install the package. For me, I'm going to install the Visual Studio one, so this one. Just go ahead and install. Okay, it's done. So next, let's go up into Edit and let's open up the Preferences. Then over here, let's go down into External Tools. And on the External Script Editor, make sure you select the one you're using. So again, for me, I'm using Visual Studio 22. And also over here, you've got a bunch of extra options. Now, if you want to play around with reading the source code for the various Unity packages, then you can tick all these boxes. But in our case, for this simple game, we don't need that. So go ahead and leave everything just like this with defaults. Okay, so with this set up, now we can go over here into Assets and open up the C# project. And this should open up Visual Studio. And alright, so here it is. Now for some more settings inside of here. In my Visual Studio, I have a really nice extension that adds a bit more colors to my code, which makes it easier to read and write. So up top, let's go into the Extensions menu and Manage Extensions. And the important one that I've installed is this one, VS4. If you want, you can go into the Online tab and over here search for it. And yep, it does show up in here. Then for the settings on that extension, let's go up here into Tools and let's open up the Options. Then over here, let's scroll down and find VS4. Yep, this one. And here are all the settings, and expand this and a bunch more settings. Now for me, I think these are only defaults. I don't remember if I changed anything. The important one is over here, the rainbow braces. So these have a bunch of colors which make it a bit easier to read the code. So let's create a simple script just to see this. So back in Unity, let's go into the project window, let's click the plus icon, and let's create a brand new C# script. Let's call it just testing, wait for it to compile, and now let's open. Now over here, I'm just going to write a bunch of simple code just to test it out. You don't have to follow this. Alright, so here's a bunch of sample code. These are the colors. You can see it makes everything a bit easier to read. Although again, this is not a requirement. You don't absolutely need this extension, but personally I do find it quite useful. I find that it helps make the code more readable than having everything be gray. Okay, so that's the setup for this extension. Next, for the text formatting options. So once again, let's go into Tools, go into Options, and then over here, let's go into the text editor. Then over here, I think I've got pretty much all the same defaults. Then we can go into the C# rules. So here are all the settings. If you notice something different on your end, go ahead and pause the video and compare the settings. But again, I think everything here is pretty much defaults. I believe the only difference that I did was over here on the code style. Over here for the new lines. Personally, I like to have the curly brackets on the same line, but if you want, you can also change it and put it on the second line. I think that's pretty much the only difference that I did. Everything else should be exactly the same as defaults. So that's the code style settings. And speaking of that, the next lecture is very important. We're going to talk a bit about naming rules. Although, just before we go, let's just clean up our testing script. So let's close this one, click on the X. Then back into Unity, we don't need the script, so let's just delete it. Okay, so with that, we have Visual Studio set up and ready to go. Now let's continue in the next lecture to learn about some naming rules.